They followed every rule. They trusted the trail and the photos. But the mountain didn't let them leave the same way they arrived. One never reached the peak. One opened the wrong tent, and one noticed someone in the photo who was never there. I took the seasonal job at the Mount Rainier Base Camp in Washington because I needed quiet more than money. And quiet is something most people assume the mountain has an endless supply of. But what they don't understand is that Mount Rainier is never truly silent. It breathes, it shifts, it listens, and I learned that far too late. I wasn't a climber by passion. I was a logistics assistant, the guy who checked permits, logged climbers' departures, monitored radios, and made sure nobody wandered into restricted zones without knowing exactly how likely they were to die. The job was meant to be temporary, something to ground me after my younger brother Evan disappeared 3 years earlier while hiking solo in the Cascades, a case that went cold so fast it was like he'd never existed at all. Working the mountain felt like staying close to him somehow, like maybe the altitude itself would bring answers the lowlands never could. On my first morning at base camp, the supervisor, a grizzled man named Holt, whose skin looked permanently windburned, handed me a laminated sheet titled Base Camp Safety Rules. There were 7 rules. I skimmed them without much thought at first. Standard stuff. Don't leave camp without logging your route. Don't climb after dark. Don't ignore weather warnings, even if the summit looks clear. Don't approach unfamiliar tracks. Don't follow voices you hear outside the camp. That one made me pause. But Holt was already walking away when I looked up, so I kept reading. Rule 6. If you hear someone calling your name from outside your tent, do not answer. Rule 7 was different. The font was smaller, like it had been added later. If someone knocks on your tent at 3:17 a.m., do not open it, no matter who they say they are. I laughed under my breath, assuming it was either a morbid joke or some kind of psychological test. But Holt must have noticed my expression because he stopped and said, "That one's not for visitors. That one's for staff." I asked him why specifically 317, and he didn't answer. He just told me that every mountain has rules people don't write down until they have to. The first few weeks passed without incident. Climbers came and went. Radios crackled with updates. Weather rolled in and out like a living thing. At night, the wind howled through the tents in a way that sounded disturbingly like distant conversation, but everyone joked about it. I tried to ignore the knot that formed in my stomach every time I checked the clock during night watch. 3:17 came and went, night after night, uneventfully, until it didn't. The first knock happened during my 3rd week, on a night so still it felt wrong. No wind, no snow, just a heavy quiet pressing down on the camp. I was awake, listening to static hiss softly from the radio, when I heard it 3 slow knocks against the canvas of the tent next to mine. Not loud, not urgent, just deliberate. I froze. The radio clock read 3:16 a.m. I told myself it was coincidence. Someone returning late. Someone confused. Then a voice spoke, muffled by fabric, but close enough that I could hear breath behind the words. "Hey, I'm lost." The voice was male, young, strained with cold. Something about it made my skin prickle, like I recognized it, but couldn't place why. I waited for the response from the other tent. It never came. The knocks repeated, slower this time, almost patient. "Please," the voice said. "I know I'm not supposed to be out here. I just need help." The clock clicked over to 3:17. Every hair on my body stood up. I remembered Rule 7. I remembered Evan, his last voicemail saying he'd heard someone calling for help off trail and felt wrong ignoring it. I stayed perfectly still. The knocks moved tent to tent, circling the camp. Some people later said they heard nothing that night. Others admitted, quietly, that they heard footsteps crunching in the snow, stopping just outside their tents, followed by soft breathing. No one opened anything. By morning, there were no tracks, no signs of anyone passing through. Holt gathered us and told us not to talk about it. "You heard the mountain settle," he said. That's all. But things changed after that. Radios began picking up faint transmissions on inactive channels, just breathing, or static shaped almost like whispering. Climbers reported seeing headlamps moving above the glacier long after curfew, lights that vanished when followed. One man swore he saw someone standing at the edge of a crevasse, facing away, wearing outdated climbing gear from decades ago. When he called out, the figure turned, and its face was wrong somehow, stretched too thin, eyes reflecting light like an animal's. He descended the same day and never returned. I started digging through old incident reports. Something Holt warned me not to do. That's when I found the pattern. Every few years, someone disappeared near base camp without explanation. No tracks leading away. No bodies. Always around mid-September. Always preceded by complaints of knocking, voices, or hearing their names called in the dark. The earliest report dated back to the 1,950 seconds. That one mentioned a ranger who vanished after opening his tent to a familiar voice. I couldn't stop thinking about Evan. His case file had mentioned something strange too. His GPS showed erratic movement shortly before it went dead, like he'd been walking in tight circles, pacing. One night, unable to sleep, I stepped outside my tent before I could talk myself out of it. The stars over Rainier were sharp and cold, the mountain looming like a black silhouette against the sky. I felt watched, not in a paranoid way, but with the certainty of prey sensing a predator it can't see. My radio crackled. At first, I thought it was interference, but then I heard my name, not shouted. Whispered, drawn out slowly, the way Evan used to say it when he wanted my attention. I dropped the radio so fast it hit the snow with a dull thud. I went back inside and didn't sleep at all. The next afternoon, Holt finally told me the truth. Or at least, his version of it. He said the mountain doesn't like empty spaces. It remembers everyone who's ever died on it, everyone who vanished without closure, and sometimes it tries to fill those absences. It doesn't make copies, he said. It makes invitations. He admitted Rule 7 was added after his predecessor disappeared 10 years ago. Same knock, same time, same voice. End quote. The mountain had learned something from that, he said, though he didn't know what. That night, I made a decision I still don't know how to feel about. At 3:10 a.m., I sat awake, staring at the tent flap, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. At 3:17, the knock came to my tent. 3 slow taps. The voice followed immediately. "I know you're awake," it said. "You came here looking for someone." My throat closed. "Evan?" I whispered before I could stop myself. There was a pause, just long enough to feel intentional. "I'm cold," the voice said. "Can you open the door?" I don't remember standing up, but suddenly I was there, my hand hovering inches from the zipper. Every instinct screamed at me to stop, but grief is louder than fear when it finally finds something that sounds like hope. I thought about the way Evan laughed, the way he always went ahead on trails, promising he'd wait up ahead. The zipper moved. Not much, just enough for freezing air to spill inside. I saw nothing outside, only darkness, but I felt something lean closer, blocking the stars. "That's enough!" Holt's voice snapped from behind me as he grabbed my arm and yanked me back. He slammed the tent shut and secured it, shouting for the others. The knocking stopped instantly. Holt didn't let go of my arm for a long time. "It almost had you," he said quietly. I quit the job the next morning. I told myself I was leaving it behind, but the truth is, the mountain didn't let me go cleanly. Sometimes, at exactly 3:17 a.m., no matter where I am, I hear knocking, not on my door, but inside my head, rhythmic and patient. And sometimes, when I'm tired enough, I hear Evan's voice asking if I'm ready to keep climbing. I first heard about Daniel Mercer in the small town of Government Camp, Oregon, the kind of place where Mount Hood looms so large it feels less like scenery and more like a silent authority, watching every movement, every mistake, and every disappearance. And I would have dismissed his story as just another tragic climbing accident, if not for the journal he left behind and the way it mirrored my own reasons for being there. I wasn't a professional climber, not even particularly ambitious. I came to Mount Hood because my father had died believing he failed at something important, and I needed to prove to myself that unfinished things could still be completed. Daniel Mercer, according to locals, had come for the same reason. He was 32, an experienced hiker but not reckless, methodical to the point of obsession. And he told people at the Timberline Lodge that this climb wasn't about the summit photos or bragging rights, but about ending a loop. That phrase stuck with me because it meant nothing at the time and everything later. Daniel signed the logbook on a Thursday morning in late October, shoulder season, when the weather on Hood turns unpredictable but not yet openly hostile, when the mountain feels deceptively forgiving. He planned a solo ascent via the South Side route, standard, well-documented, and supposedly safe if respected. The ranger on duty noted that Daniel asked an unusual question before leaving, whether anyone had ever reported getting lost while still going uphill. The ranger laughed and told him that as long as you're gaining elevation, you're doing something right. His body was found 3 days later, well below the trailhead, at an elevation lower than where he'd parked his car, curled against a stand of trees, as if he'd simply sat down and never gotten back up. And the first thing the coroner said was that it didn't make sense. Hypothermia, yes, but not where he was found. Not with the gear he had. Not with the journal still zipped safely inside his jacket, dry and intact. I came across Daniel's story because I volunteered with a local search and rescue auxiliary during my stay, partly out of guilt, partly out of a need to be close to the mountain without challenging it directly, and partly because I couldn't shake the feeling that Hood wasn't done teaching lessons to people who thought they understood it. The journal wasn't supposed to be public, but stories like this never stay contained in small towns. And one night, over burnt coffee at a diner off Highway 26, a deputy let it slip that Daniel had kept detailed notes, time-stamped, precise, written in a tight, disciplined hand that slowly degraded into something frantic and uneven. I asked to see it. I told myself it was curiosity, but the truth was simpler. I recognized the shape of unresolved grief when I heard it. Daniel's first entries were calm, almost clinical. He wrote about snow conditions, visibility, wind direction. He noted landmarks and altitude markers with GPS precision. At 9:40 a.m., he wrote that the climb felt easier than expected, that the mountain was quiet in a way that feels earned. At 10:15, he mentioned something odd, not dangerous, Just strange that the trail markers seemed farther apart than he remembered from his research, that the distances between familiar features felt stretched, like walking down a hallway where the walls subtly drift apart the farther you go. He dismissed it as fatigue. By 11:30, he wrote that his altimeter and GPS disagreed by almost 300 feet. He trusted the altimeter. At noon, he stopped for lunch and wrote something that made my throat tighten when I read it. I feel like I've been climbing longer than I should be. Not tired, just delayed. That's when the hooks started setting in, subtle enough that you almost miss them if you're not looking. At 12:45, he wrote that he could hear wind above him but none around him, like weather happening somewhere else, following a schedule he wasn't part of. At 1:10, he wrote that he passed the same rock formation twice, a bent slab that looked like a broken tooth, and laughed it off, blaming whiteout conditions even though he noted visibility was still good. The last entry, before things changed, was at 1:42 p.m., where he wrote, "If I didn't know better, I'd say the mountain is rearranging itself." After that, the timestamps grew closer together, the handwriting sharper, pressed harder into the paper. He wrote that the slope felt steeper, but his elevation wasn't increasing. He wrote that his legs burned as if climbing stairs that never reached the next floor. He wrote that he began counting steps 100 at a time to prove to himself that progress was real, only to look up and realize the horizon hadn't changed at all. At 2:30, he wrote, "I should have reached the summit by now." At 2:47, he crossed that out and replaced it with, "I should at least be close." At 3:05, the entry was only one sentence. "I don't think I'm going up anymore." This was the point where the search and rescue team said exposure and oxygen deprivation could explain confusion. But I've been high enough to know the difference between tired mistakes and something more deliberate, more structured. Daniel wrote about hearing his own breathing echo back to him from ahead, slightly delayed, as if something up the slope was mimicking him imperfectly. He wrote that his footprints behind him looked wrong, too deep, too sharp, like someone heavier had been following in his exact steps. At 3:22, he stopped writing for nearly an hour. When the entries resumed, the handwriting was smaller, compressed into the corner of the page. He wrote that he turned around, that descending felt like the right decision, and that the relief he felt was immediate and unsettling, like the mountain had been waiting for him to make that choice. At 4:10, he wrote something that still gives me chills. "Going down is harder. The trail doesn't recognize me." He described landmarks appearing out of order, tree lines where there should be open snowfields, patches of bare ground at elevations that should have been frozen solid. He wrote that his GPS now insisted he was below the trailhead, even though he could still see the summit above him through thinning clouds. At 4:45, he wrote, "I can see my car in my head. I don't think it's real." At 5, daylight fading, he wrote that the slope felt like it was tilting the wrong way, like gravity itself had been subtly reoriented. He described the sensation of walking downhill while his body screamed that it was climbing, lungs burning, calves trembling, heart pounding as if he were still gaining elevation. The last full entry was written at 5:17 p.m., the pen nearly tearing the page. "I have been descending for hours. I am lower than where I started. I never reached the peak." Below that, scrawled so faintly it was almost invisible, was one final line, written at an angle. "I don't think the mountain lets you finish unless it wants you to." Daniel's body was found the next morning by a pair of hunters who thought he was resting. There were no signs of panic, no defensive injuries, no indication he'd been running or lost control. He was sitting upright, back against a tree, boots planted neatly side by side, hands folded in his lap, eyes open and unfocused, like someone waiting for instructions that never came. The search team noted something else they didn't put in the official report. His boots were packed with snow that didn't match any snow pattern on the surrounding ground, as if he'd walked through a different version of the mountain before ending up there. After reading the journal, I stopped volunteering. I stopped hiking altogether. But Mount Hood has a way of inserting itself into your life once you've paid attention to it, and months later, back home, I started noticing things that didn't make sense. Staircases felt longer than they should. Elevators felt like they were moving without changing floors. I would walk familiar routes and feel that same stretching sensation Daniel described, like progress without arrival. Sometimes, when I'm tired enough, I dream I'm climbing, counting steps, convinced that if I just keep going, I'll reach something that proves the effort mattered. And sometimes, in those dreams, I realize I've been walking downhill the entire time, lungs burning, legs shaking, and I understand exactly what Daniel meant when he wrote that the mountain decides when you're done, not you. I didn't notice him in the photo at first, and that's the part that still bothers me most, because it means whatever was standing behind us on the summit of Mount Whitney wasn't obvious. It blended in, waited to be found, the way things do when they're patient. I had driven to Lone Pine, California, in late August to scatter my mother's ashes, even though I told people I was there to hike, because saying you're chasing closure sounds less fragile when you dress it up as something physical and measurable, like reaching the highest point in the contiguous United States. My mom had loved mountains but never climbed them, and after she died suddenly of a brain aneurysm, I was left with a constant sense that conversations had ended mid-sentence. The hike was supposed to be my way of finishing one. I joined a small group for the ascent, 4 of us total, strangers bound by permits and weather windows because solo climbing felt too close to admitting how alone I actually was. There was Mark, a software engineer from San Jose, who talked too much when he was nervous. Elena, quiet and observant, the kind of person who notices things without announcing it. And Josh, who had summited Whitney twice before and treated the mountain like an old acquaintance he didn't entirely trust. We started from Whitney Portal before dawn. Headlamps cutting through the thin, cold air. The smell of pine and dust sharp in my nose. And everything felt normal in that comforting, procedural way that makes you believe the day will follow the rules you've imagined for it. The first hook came early, subtle enough to dismiss. A sound like footsteps behind us when we stopped to rest, crunching gravel that went silent the moment we turned around. Josh laughed it off, said sound travels weird at altitude, but Elena glanced back longer than the rest of us, her brow furrowed like she'd almost recognized a shape in the darkness. As the sun rose, the mountain revealed itself in layers, granite faces glowing pale gold, switchbacks stacking like a promise you keep renegotiating with your own lungs. We talked about normal things: work, relationships, the usual defenses people throw up when surrounded by too much silence, but every so often, the conversation would stall, as if someone had missed a cue. Around trail camp, Mark mentioned feeling like we were being watched, then immediately apologized for sounding dramatic. Josh didn't tease him. He just said, "Whitney does that to people," in a tone that suggested experience rather than humor. By the time we reached the 99 switchbacks, the air was thin enough that every thought felt heavier, like it had to fight its way into existence, and that's when the second hook sank in. I checked my phone for the time, not for signal, just habit, and the camera app opened instead, showing a photo I didn't remember taking. A blurry shot of rock and sky, time-stamped an hour earlier. with a dark smudge near the top that I couldn't quite identify. I assumed it was accidental, something I'd snapped while pulling the phone from my pocket, and closed it without thinking. The climb to the summit was harder than I expected, not physically so much as mentally, because the landscape started to feel repetitive in a way that was difficult to articulate, like we were moving through variations of the same scene rather than progressing forward. Elena mentioned that the wind sounded wrong up there, not constant, but patterned, rising and falling in intervals that felt intentional, almost communicative. Josh told her altitude sickness can mess with perception, but he kept adjusting his pack straps like something was off balance. When we finally reached the summit hut, the relief was immediate and euphoric. The world stretching out in all directions beneath a sky so intensely blue it looked artificial. We hugged, took turns posing for photos, and for a brief moment, I felt something unclench in my chest. A sense that maybe this was enough, that standing there could count as an ending. A hiker from another group offered to take a photo of all four of us together, and I remember thinking how grateful I was not to have to ask. We lined up with the hut behind us, the Sierra Nevada unfolding beyond, and the stranger snapped 3 quick shots before handing my phone back with a smile and a comment about how clear the day was. I looked at the screen, saw our faces squinting in the sunlight, and shoved the phone back into my pocket, content to review it later. The descent started smoothly enough, but the mountain felt different going down, like it had switched moods while we weren't paying attention. The wind picked up in short, sharp bursts, and clouds began to gather with a speed that felt personal, like they were responding to our presence rather than the forecast. About an hour below the summit, Mark slipped on loose gravel and twisted his ankle badly enough that we had to stop. It wasn't a crisis, but it slowed us down, and with the light starting to change, Josh made the call to set up an early camp near trail camp rather than push through. That night, as the temperature dropped and the sky filled with stars, I felt an unease I couldn't explain, a sense that something unfinished had followed us down. I checked the summit photos while lying in my tent, scrolling through them with numb fingers, and that's when I noticed him. In the second photo, just behind Mark's shoulder, partially obscured by glare, was a figure standing where there shouldn't have been anyone, tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old-style climbing jacket, the kind you see in black and white photos from the 1,930 seconds. The face was indistinct, blurred by motion or light, but the posture was unmistakable, upright, attentive, facing the camera. I told myself it was a trick of shadow, lens flare, something explainable if I stared long enough. But the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt, like my brain was trying to reconcile 2 incompatible truths. I zoomed in, and the image degraded into pixels, the figure dissolving into static that made my eyes ache. I didn't show anyone that night. I told myself it would sound paranoid, that altitude and exhaustion were messing with me. But sleep came in shallow, broken fragments, punctuated by dreams of standing still while the world moved backward around me. In the morning, Elena approached me quietly while the others packed up and asked if I'd noticed anything strange about the photos. My stomach dropped. She hadn't seen the figure clearly, she said. Just a sense that something was off, that the background didn't match her memory of where everyone had been standing. When I showed her the zoomed-out version without enlarging it, she went pale anyway. "There were only 4 of us," she said, not as a question. We decided to tell Josh, who studied the image for a long time before handing the phone back with a tight expression. He said there were stories, unofficial ones, about people seeing extra figures in summit photos, usually dismissed as pareidolia or prank hikers wandering into frame, but he'd never seen one himself. "The mountain has a history," he said carefully. "People go missing up here. Sometimes they leave things behind." The rest of the descent was tense and quiet, each of us hyper-aware of our surroundings, flinching at sounds that echoed too closely. Mark was focused on his ankle and didn't notice our unease, which felt like a mercy. When we reached Whitney Portal and the mundane world rushed back in the smell of burgers from the store, the sound of car doors slamming, I felt a wave of relief so strong it was almost disorienting. We exchanged numbers, promised to send photos, and went our separate ways. But the mountain didn't stay behind. That night, in my motel room in Lone Pine, I couldn't stop thinking about the figure's posture, the way it seemed to be participating without belonging. I pulled up the photos again, this time on my laptop, enlarging them carefully, adjusting contrast and brightness the way my mom had taught me back when photography was her hobby. That's when I noticed the third hook. The figure wasn't casting a shadow in the same direction as the rest of us. In fact, it barely cast one at all. The more I adjusted the image, the more details emerged. Stitching on the jacket that matched designs from early mountaineering expeditions, boots that looked too heavy for modern climbs, and a suggestion of something wrong with the face, not monstrous, but incomplete, like a reflection that hadn't finished loading. I searched for information about missing climbers on Mount Whitney and fell down a rabbit hole of old reports, forum posts, and archived news articles, many of them mentioning strange photographs, inexplicable audio recordings, and a persistent rumor that the mountain sometimes left people behind in pieces rather than taking them whole. I found one story from the 1940 seconds about a climber named Thomas Caldwell who vanished near the summit during a sudden storm. His body never recovered, but whose name appeared years later in the background of a group photo taken by another party. The photo was lost in a fire, but the description matched what I'd seen too closely to ignore. When I returned home, the sense of being watched followed me. Subtle, but constant, like pressure behind the eyes. I started noticing reflections that lingered a fraction of a second too long, shadows that didn't align. Elena emailed me, saying she couldn't sleep, that she kept dreaming of standing on the summit while someone counted behind her. Slowly, patiently, Josh stopped responding to messages entirely. Mark sent a cheerful update about his ankle healing and joked about planning another climb next year. I didn't reply. The final hook came weeks later, when I decided to print the summit photo, thinking that maybe making it physical would strip it of its power, turn it into just ink and paper. When the print came out of the machine, my heart sank. The figure was clearer than it had ever been on the screen, standing directly behind me now, closer than before, its hand almost touching my shoulder. And this time, the face wasn't blurred. It looked like my mother, not as she'd been when she died, but younger, from old photos I hadn't looked at in years, her expression calm and expectant, eyes fixed on the camera like she'd finally found the right place to stand. I tore the photo in half and then into smaller pieces, my hands shaking. But even as I did, a part of me understood the terrible logic of it. The mountain hadn't added someone to our group. It had reflected what we brought with us, our unfinished conversations, our unresolved grief. And it had done so without malice, the way natural processes operate without regard for human comfort. I don't hike anymore. I don't take photos at high places. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that summit again, the vastness stretching out in every direction, and I feel a presence at my back, waiting patiently for me to turn around and acknowledge it. And I know that if I ever do, I won't be coming back alone.